She didn't sleep in a bed. Despite the room's furnishings, despite the mattress being thicker and cleaner than anything she'd ever touched in her life, she still curled up on the cold wooden floor every night. No one understood why. No one dared ask. But that night, as the storm raged on Blackridge Manor and muffled sobs seeped through the cracks in the door, the most powerful man in the building stopped. And he heard it all. If you want to know what made a cold-blooded mafia boss decide to burn down an entire criminal empire for a maid, hit like, comment the city you're viewing so I know how far my story has progressed, and don't turn off the screen. The woman arrived on a Tuesday, which meant nobody paid her much attention. Tuesday deliveries at Blackridge Manor came by the truckload: wine crates from the Carolinas, dry goods from a supplier in Newark whose name changed every 6 months, and occasionally new staff. The housekeeper, Mrs. Aldrin, processed all 3 categories with the same flat efficiency. She signed forms. She pointed people toward their rooms. She moved on. Elena Vale stood in the service entrance with a canvas bag that weighed less than a child's backpack and waited to be told where to go. She was 26, maybe 27. She answered that question differently depending on who asked, and nobody had noticed yet. Her hair was dark and pulled back so tightly it looked like it caused her pain. Her eyes moved constantly, cataloging every exit, every face, every hand that reached toward her before withdrawing. When Mrs. Aldrin held out the uniform without making eye contact, Elena took it with both hands and said, "Thank you," twice in the span of 4 seconds. "Kitchen duty starts at 5, Mrs. Aldrin said. "Don't be late. Mr. Voss doesn't tolerate late." Elena nodded. She didn't ask who Mr. Voss was. She didn't need to. The name was stenciled into the iron gate at the entrance of the property, pressed into the leather of every chair in the staff common room, present in the way every person in this building kept their spine slightly straighter than was natural. Damien Voss. She had researched him before applying. Not thoroughly. Thoroughly would have been dangerous, left digital traces. But enough to understand the shape of the man. Enough to know that working here was either the smartest decision she'd ever made or the last one. She chose to believe it was smart. The room assigned to her was on the 3rd floor of the East Wing, separated from the other domestic staff by half a corridor and a locked door that Mrs. Aldrin opened with a key she then handed over without comment. The room was generous for a housemaid's quarters. Real curtains, a radiator that worked, a bed with a proper mattress and clean sheets pulled tight across the corners. Elena set her bag on the chair by the window. She looked at the bed for a long moment. Then she took the spare blanket from the closet, folded it twice lengthwise, and laid it on the floor beside the bed. She slept there instead. By her 3rd day at the manor, Elena had learned the rhythms of the house the way a person learns the rhythms of weather, not by thinking about them, but by absorbing them through skin and reflex. She knew that the morning shift in the kitchen ran lean because the chef, a heavy-set man named Goran, arrived 40 minutes before anyone else and preferred silence. She knew that the 2 security personnel posted near the main foyer changed positions every 90 minutes, and that the shift change created a 12-second window when neither was watching the east corridor. She knew that Mr. Voss took his coffee at 7:15, that he did not eat breakfast, and that he used the private study on the 2nd floor for 3 hours every morning before anyone was permitted to approach him for any reason short of the building being actively on fire. She learned these things not because she was planning anything. She learned them because she had spent most of her life in places where knowing the layout was the difference between a bad night and a catastrophic one. The other staff watched her with the particular curiosity of people who sense something is off but can't name it. Pris, who handled the guest rooms and had a habit of chewing the inside of her lip when she talked, tried twice to draw Elena into conversation over breakfast. Both times Elena answered in short, complete sentences that revealed nothing and discouraged follow-up. Not rudely, just closed, like a window that had been painted shut so long the seal had calcified. "You from the city?" Pris asked on the 4th morning. "Originally," Elena said. "Which part?" Elena looked up from her food. "South Side." Pris nodded like that meant something. "How'd you end up at a place like this?" "Applied. Got the job." Elena picked up her plate and carried it to the sink before Pris could ask anything else. What Elena did not tell her, she had applied to 11 different private estates in a 100-mile radius over the past 3 months. She had been turned down by 7. 2 had offered positions she declined when she discovered they were connected, in ways that took real digging to uncover, to men who moved money for people she needed to stay invisible from. One she had simply stopped pursuing when she realized, during the background check phase, that the employer was running a consulting firm that appeared, on the surface, to provide security services for nonprofits. Blackridge Manor was the 11th. She chose it because Damien Voss's enemies were different from her enemies, and in her experience, that was the closest thing to safety that existed. She had been wrong before, though. She was aware of that. The bruises on her left side, 3 of them, yellowing at the edges now, pressed into the curve of her ribs, were a reminder of the last time she had miscalculated. She'd gotten those 2 weeks before arriving here, when someone who shouldn't have known her current alias had left a note under the door of her temporary apartment. The note contained only her original name, the name she had spent 4 years erasing. She had packed everything she owned in 11 minutes and never returned to that apartment. She did not think about the name, not if she could help it. The name belonged to a person who had been systematically dismantled over the course of many years, and whatever was left afterward, the thing that flinched at sudden movement and apologized before being accused and folded every piece of cloth with compulsive precision, that thing had chosen a different name and was trying to move forward with it. Forward. One day at a time, one household at a time. She was mopping the east corridor on her 6th day when she heard the footsteps. Not running, not aggressive, just heavy, measured. The footsteps of someone accustomed to every room rearranging itself around their presence rather than the other way around. She heard them coming from the staircase and had maybe 4 seconds before they would round the corner and encounter her. And in those 4 seconds, she did what she always did. Assessed, cataloged, calculated where she could put her eyes. That was respectful without being submissive, and submissive without appearing to be hiding something. She was looking at the baseboard when he appeared. Damien Voss was not what she had expected from photographs. Not shorter, not older. The photographs were accurate in those respects. What they hadn't captured was the particular quality of stillness he carried. He moved into the corridor the way a pressure system moves into a valley. The temperature didn't change, but something did. He was wearing a dark shirt, no jacket, the sleeves rolled to the elbows in a way that said this was a man who had long since stopped performing casualness. He was on the phone, speaking in a low, clipped exchange that Elena clocked as Italian in the 3 seconds she caught before deliberately stopping herself from listening. He glanced at her once, not dismissively, not with interest, just recorded, filed, moved on. He passed her and continued down the corridor. Elena exhaled through her nose and returned to mopping. She did not think about his eyes. She thought about the floor. That was on a Friday. The storm started Saturday evening and had fully committed to catastrophe by 10 o'clock that night. Elena lay on her blanket on the floor and listened to the rain hit the window panes with the flat aggression of something that had been building all day. She wasn't asleep. Sleep had been unreliable for most of her life, arriving in unpredictable patches and departing without warning. And tonight her ribs ached, and the sound of rain against glass had a way of pulling her backward in time to places she was not trying to revisit. She tried to control her breathing. She had been taught a technique for this. She'd taught it to herself, actually, in a library bathroom when she was 17 using a book she'd managed to read in pieces over several weeks. And it helped sometimes. Breathe in for 4 counts, hold for 4, release for 6. The idea was to trick the body's alarm system into standing down. Her body had an alarm system that ran on a hair trigger and had been doing so for a decade. It didn't always respond to tricks. She was somewhere between waking and a place she didn't want to be when the nightmare caught up to her anyway. Not a dramatic one. She'd had those, the kind that put her back in the basement corridor with the sound of the lock turning. This was quieter than that. Just voices. Just the specific timbre of authority being used to diminish, to instruct, to remind her that the rules existed for her protection and she should be grateful for them. She didn't realize she was speaking until she heard herself. A whisper. Ragged and small and barely there. Please, don't wake him. I'll take the punishment. Please. She surfaced sharply, heart already hammering before her eyes fully opened. The room was dark. The rain was still going, She was on the floor of Blackridge Manor, and she was 26 years old, and nobody in this building wanted to hurt her, probably, and she was fine. She pressed one hand flat against the floorboards and breathed. She did not hear the footsteps outside her door. She did not hear them stop. She did not hear the long pause, 3 or 4 seconds of complete stillness, before they continued down the corridor and faded. She had no idea. Sunday morning arrived gray and wet, and Elena was in the kitchen by 4:58 with her uniform pressed and her face composed into the particular arrangement of expressions she'd developed over years of not wanting people to look at her too closely. Garan acknowledged her with a nod. She began the prep work without being asked, because knowing what to do before being told was another kind of protection. It was during the 10 o'clock staff briefing, Mrs. Zaw Aldrin, 6 household employees, one of the security team stopping in briefly to request a schedule change, that Elena first noticed the difference. It was subtle enough that she almost missed it. Almost. The head of security, a man named Harker, who spoke in short declarative sentences and looked at everyone in the room with the same calibrated neutrality, had shifted his briefing slightly. Nothing obvious. Just a rotation adjustment in the East Wing. A suggestion that 2 staff check in rather than 1 when working alone in the upper floors. An added camera placement mentioned so casually it could have been routine maintenance. It wasn't routine maintenance. Elena knew what routine maintenance looked like. This was surveillance adjustment. She kept her face still. She focused on the notepad in front of her, the roster of rooms she'd be servicing that day. She did not look at Harker again. She cleaned rooms, she changed linens, she restocked the guest bathrooms on the 2nd floor with the particular focused quietness she brought to every task, the kind of thoroughness that left nothing unchecked and nothing misaligned, because correctness was the closest thing to control she had access to in most situations. She was finishing the last room when she found the envelope. It was propped against the door of her room when she returned in the late afternoon, her arms full of the day's collected laundry. A plain envelope, unsealed. Her name on it. Not her name, her current name, Elena Vale, written in handwriting that was precise without being practiced. She stood in the corridor for a moment, arms still full, and looked at it. She set the laundry down. She opened the envelope. Inside was a single card. On it, 3 words in that same careful handwriting. You are safe. No signature. Elena stood very still in the dim corridor while the rain against the windows kept its steady drumbeat, and somewhere below her, she could hear the distant movement of the house going about its afternoon. She read the card twice. She read it a 3rd time. Then she folded it carefully, slid it back into the envelope, and stood there for another full minute without moving. Her hands were not shaking. She made sure of that. But her mind was running very fast through a set of calculations she had hoped she wouldn't need to perform for a while yet. Who knew enough to write that? What they knew. How they knew it. Whether those 3 words meant what they appeared to mean, or whether they were a message of an entirely different kind, the kind that arrived under doors and other forms and preceded catastrophic things. She went into her room. She sat on the edge of the bed, the actual bed, which she rarely used, and placed the envelope on her knee and thought, "You are safe." The people who had spent years ensuring that she was anything but safe operated on a very specific principle: visible calm in the message, chaos in the delivery. They were not subtle in the way this note was subtle. This was not their style. But then, she had been wrong before. The bruise on her ribs was still reminding her of that. What she was certain of, someone in this house had heard her the previous night. Someone had drawn a conclusion, and that someone, whoever they were, had made a choice about what to do with that conclusion. She did not know yet whether to be relieved or terrified. What she found out 3 hours later, when Harker appeared at her door and told her in his flat declarative way that Mr. Voss was requesting a brief word with her in the ground floor library, made the decision significantly more complicated. Elena stood up. She smoothed her uniform. She looked at herself once in the small mirror above the dresser, and whatever she saw there, she didn't let it touch her expression. She followed Harker down the stairs. The library door was already open when she arrived. The room was large. Shelves floor to ceiling, 2 leather chairs flanking a fireplace that wasn't currently lit, the kind of space that had been assembled for the impression of permanence. Damien Voss stood at the far end near the window with his back partly toward her and a glass of something dark held loosely at his side. He didn't turn immediately. He let her enter. He let the silence occupy the room for a moment, and Elena recognized that move. She recognized it from people who understood that silence was a pressure a lot of people couldn't resist filling. She did not feel it. Eventually, he turned. He looked at her the way he had looked at her in the corridors, like cataloging, filing, and except this time there was something additional behind it, something that was the opposite of the dispassionate surveillance she'd been bracing for. "You've been here 8 days," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Elena said. "You know your job." "I try to." He looked at the glass in his hand, then back at her. "I don't make a habit of explaining myself to my staff," he said. "I'm not going to start now, but I'm going to tell you one thing, and you can do what you want with it." Elena waited. Damien Voss set his glass down on the windowsill and looked at her with the directness of a man who had spent a great deal of his life cutting through whatever people put between themselves and the truth. "Whatever you're running from," he said, "it hasn't followed you here." Elena's expression didn't change. She was very good at that. It was one of the few things she was proud of, actually, the architecture of stillness she'd built over years of needing it. "I'm not running from anything," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Something moved behind his eyes that she couldn't read. "All right," he said, simply, without argument. He picked up his glass. "That's all." Elena turned and walked out of the library. She walked down the corridor at a measured pace. She went back up the stairs. She went into her room. She sat on the floor with her back against the bed, and her knees pulled up to her chest, and she breathed. 4 counts in, hold, 6 counts out, until the shaking in her hands stopped. She did not know what had just happened. She did not know what he knew or how much of it, or what he intended to do with whatever knowledge he had. She did not know whether the note was from him or from someone else in this house, and she did not know whether to pack her bag tonight or whether leaving would be the move that finally drew the kind of attention she'd been avoiding. What she knew was this: Damien Voss had looked at her like a man who had already seen through the surface, and he had said nothing that should have frightened her, but somewhere in the city outside these walls, her original name was circulating among people who would pay a great deal of money to know which direction she'd run. She pulled her knees tighter. Above the manor, the storm had not yet broken, and somewhere 2 floors below her, in a study she had never entered, the man who owned this house opened a laptop and began making calls she could not hear. Calls to people whose names never appeared in any official record. Calls that, one by one, began pulling at the threads of an institution that had protected itself for decades behind the language of charity and the bright, clean image of rescued children. Elena didn't know that yet either. She was still trying to decide whether to run. She thought about it until 2 in the morning, sitting with her back against the bed frame and the envelope balanced on her knee. And in the end, she didn't run because running required a destination, and she was out of those. Every safe house she'd ever arranged for herself had a shelf life. Every alias had a ceiling. She had burned through 4 cities in 3 years, and each time she'd started over with less money, less time, less certainty that the next place would hold. Blackridge Manor was still standing. That was the argument she made to herself. It wasn't a good argument, but it was the one she had. She slept 3 hours on the floor, woke before her alarm, and went downstairs to start her shift. Monday passed without incident. So did Tuesday. Damien Voss did not summon her again. He did not look at her differently in the corridors, did not signal in any way that their conversation in the library had altered anything. He moved through his house with the same contained authority he always did, and the house adjusted around him the same way it always had. And Elena cleaned rooms and changed linens and told herself that maybe she had overthought the whole thing. She was good at overthinking. It had kept her alive, mostly. It also made it very difficult to sleep. Wednesday morning, she was restocking the supply closet on the 2nd floor when she heard 2 of the security team in the adjacent corridor. She wasn't trying to listen. She had learned long ago that intentional eavesdropping was a liability. It required a quality of stillness that itself attracted attention. But the door was ajar, and the 2 men were not being particularly careful, and she caught the shape of the conversation without meaning to. 3 names came back from Voss's contact in Baltimore, the first one said. Low, flat, the voice of a man reporting information rather than discussing it. Clean, the second one asked. 2 of them. Third one flagged. A pause. How far back? Far enough. They moved away and she lost the rest of it. She stood in the supply closet with a stack of folded towels pressed against her chest and breathed very slowly and thought about what far enough meant when attached to a name that had been flagged. She put the towels on the shelf. She finished the supply closet. She continued her shift. That afternoon, she made a mistake. It was small, the kind of thing that only mattered in retrospect, and only then if you were the type of person who cataloged every error in precise detail, which she was. She was collecting the breakfast things from the small sitting room adjacent to the East Library, a room she'd been told Mr. Voss rarely used, when she turned from the sideboard and found him standing in the doorway watching her. She startled, not dramatically, not the full-body flinch she sometimes produced without meaning to, just a sharp inhale, an involuntary step backward, the immediate tightening of both hands around the tray she was carrying. Damien Voss noticed all of it. She could tell because his eyes moved fractionally before the rest of him did, cataloging the flinch the way she cataloged exits. "I didn't mean to," she started. "You don't need to apologize," he said. She closed her mouth, set the tray down on the table beside her because her hands needed somewhere to go. He came into the room and picked up the newspaper from the chair nearest the window. That was apparently why he was here. The newspaper, which she had not moved because she'd been uncertain whether it was meant to be cleared. And then he stopped on his way back out and looked at her with that same directness that she found profoundly difficult to prepare for. "The supply rotation on this floor," he said. "You changed it." It wasn't an accusation. It was closer to an observation. "The original schedule had a coverage gap in the afternoon," she said carefully. "2 rooms weren't being serviced until after 6. I adjusted the order so everything was completed before 4. He looked at her for a moment. "Nobody asked you to do that." "No." "You just noticed the gap." "Yes." He folded the newspaper. "Harker mentioned you'd rerouted the laundry collection too." She hadn't known Harker had noticed that. She filed the information. The original route doubled back on itself. It was inefficient. Damien Voss was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he was thinking and not, as many people mistook it, finished with the conversation. Then he said, "What did you do before this?" Elena looked at him steadily. "Various things. Household work? Some. What else?" "Whatever was available." She picked the tray back up. "I should finish the floor." He didn't stop her. She went out and continued working and did not let herself think about the way he'd asked that question. Methodical, unhurried, the kind of question that had other questions behind it already arranged in a line. Thursday brought a visitor. The car arrived mid-morning, a dark sedan that parked in the motor court without announcement. Elena was working in the East Wing when she heard it, and her body registered the sound before her mind did. Something tightening between her shoulder blades, a heightening of the ambient sensory detail around her. She continued working. She told herself this was irrelevant. People came to the manor regularly on business she had no connection to. She was in the corridor when the visitor passed through the main hall below, escorted by Harker. She got one look from the top of the staircase. Male, 60s, expensive coat, the kind of haircut that said inherited money rather than earned. He carried a leather document case and moved through the manor with the ease of someone who had been here before. She went back to work. That evening, Pris found her in the laundry room and sat on the counter in a way that communicated she intended to stay for a while. "You know who that was today?" Pris said. "No." "Commissioner Aldrich, City Planning. He and Voss have some kind of arrangement that goes back years." She paused. "At least that's the official version?" Elena sorted linens. "What's the unofficial one?" Pris chewed the inside of her lip. "My cousin works downtown. She says Aldrich has been nervous for months, like something's coming and he knows it but can't stop it. Politicians are always nervous about something." "Sure." Pris watched her for a moment. "You're not curious at all, are you?" Elena looked up. "About what?" "About any of it. About what Voss actually does. About why a man like Aldrich comes here personally instead of sending someone." She tilted her head. "Most people who work here have questions their first week. You ask about laundry routes." Elena set a folded sheet on the pile. "Questions about things that aren't your business have a way of becoming problems," she said. "In my experience." Pris was quiet for a moment, then, Whose business were they, before? The questions. Elena didn't answer that. She picked up the next sheet and kept working, and after a moment Pris slid off the counter and left without pushing further. She was more perceptive than Elena had initially assessed. Elena adjusted her file on her accordingly. Friday morning, 6:48 a.m. Elena was in the kitchen corridor carrying a prepared tray toward the staff dining room when she heard raised voices from the study. The door was not fully closed. Someone had pulled it to without catching the latch, and the voices were distinct enough that stopping to shift the weight of the tray was a plausible cover for the 4 seconds she spent in the corridor outside it. Can't sit on this indefinitely. The voice was not Damien's, older, tighter, the particular quality of a man who was accustomed to being listened to and was currently not being listened to in the way he expected. If what you found is accurate, then there are protocols. Protocols. Damien's voice was flat. One word, the way a door closes. Federal involvement becomes unavoidable at a certain point. Nothing becomes unavoidable, Damien said. Things become unavoidable when people make them unavoidable. Damien, listen to me. A pause. There are people connected to this that you do not want to move against without... Tell me one name, Damien said, that I should be afraid of. Take your time. Silence. Right, Damien said. The sound of something being set down, deliberate. I'll handle what needs handling. You stay out of it until I tell you otherwise. And if you're wrong about this? If the girl isn't who you think she is? Elena stopped breathing. She's exactly who I think she is, Damien said. That's the problem. She walked away from the door, steady, even pace. She made it to the staff dining room and set the tray down and stood with both palms flat on the table and looked at the far wall and thought, he knows. He knew her name, not Elena Vale. The other one, the one she'd been trying to bury for 4 years. The question that followed immediately after that one, how much else does he know, and what does he intend to do with it, was the kind of question that had previously preceded her packing a bag and moving in the early morning hours. She stayed. She ate. She went back to work. By afternoon, she'd made a decision. Not a comfortable one. A necessary one. If Damien Voss had identified her, then she needed to know what he was doing with that identification before she could make any informed choice about her next step. Staying and not knowing was worse than either leaving or confronting it. She was not going to confront it. Not directly, not yet. But she was going to watch. She began that evening. Small things, careful things. The kind of observation that looked like nothing from the outside. She noted which members of staff entered the study and when they left. She noted which calls Harker took on a separate phone from his regular line, a detail she'd filed 2 days ago and was now reassigning weight to. She noted the rhythm of the security rotation adjustments that had been ongoing since the beginning of the week, and when she mapped them in her head, they resolved into a pattern that had nothing to do with routine maintenance and everything to do with external threat assessment. Something was coming toward this house. She didn't know yet whether she was the reason or whether she had arrived in the middle of something already in motion. Saturday, she found out. She was changing the linens in the corner guest room, unoccupied, scheduled for cleaning as a matter of routine, when she found the photograph tucked behind the baseboard heater. Not hidden deliberately. It had fallen or slipped. An old photograph, the kind taken before everything was digital, the edges slightly curled. She picked it up. It showed the front entrance of a building she recognized, not from personal experience, from the specific quality of nightmares, the arch of the doorway, the white-painted columns that were supposed to signal safety and instead signaled something else entirely, the small carved letters above the entrance that spelled out St. Bridget's Children's Haven in formal serif font. She stared at it for 3 seconds. Then she turned it over. On the back, in handwriting that was not the same as the handwriting on her note, were 2 lines. A date, 17 years ago, and a list of 5 initials arranged in a column. The third set of initials was hers. Elena set the photograph back where she'd found it, replacing it in the exact position and angle. She straightened up. She finished making the bed with perfect hospital corners. She collected her supplies and walked out of the room and went to the next room on her list and started over. Her hands did not shake. She had worked very hard on that, but her mind was doing something she tried hard to prevent. It was going back. Not all the way. Not to the basement with the locked door and the sound of the bolt turning. Just to the edges of that time, the peripheral details that were somehow worse than the central ones. The smell of industrial cleaner, the specific texture of the floor tiles in the hallway, the sound of her own voice trained down to a whisper so that it would never be loud enough to disturb anyone who mattered. She had been 11 years old in that building. She had left it at 18 under circumstances that were still, technically, an open matter with several parties who maintained a vested interest in locating her. The photograph meant someone connected to that building had been in this room, or had information that passed through this room, or that the photograph had been placed here deliberately for her to find by someone who knew her schedule. By Sunday afternoon, she had exhausted that line of thinking and arrived at the only conclusion that resolved all the variables simultaneously. Damien Voss was not just aware of her past. He had been actively investigating it. The photograph was a piece of something larger that was being assembled in this house around her, and she didn't know yet whether she was the subject of that assembly or its beneficiary. She knocked on the study door at 4 o'clock. There was a pause, and then, "Come in." She entered, closed the door behind her. Damien was at his desk, no laptop open, no papers in his hands. He'd been thinking or waiting or both. He looked at her with that measuring quality and did not speak first. "You know where I came from," she said. Not a question. She was done pretending. He held her gaze. "Yes." "How long?" "I had a preliminary picture by the end of your first week. The full picture took longer." He paused. "I wasn't certain about a few things until recently." "And what do you intend to do with it?" He leaned back in his chair, looked at her steadily. "What do you think I'm going to do with it?" "I don't know," she said. "That's why I'm here." Damien Voss was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the late afternoon light was flattening, and the grounds of the manor had taken on the particular stillness that came at the edge of evening. St. Bridget's Children's Haven has been operating a trafficking network out of its lower facility for at least 40 years, he said. Not gently, not with particular emotion, like he was reading coordinates. Children processed through what appeared to be adoption channels. Those who resisted conditioning were held in long-term internal placement. The records were maintained, which means there are financial trails, ledgers, communications. The organization is currently under no investigation because 4 individuals in positions of federal oversight have been financially compromised, and 2 more are directly connected to the network's founding. Elena stood very still. "You were there from age 6 to age 18, he continued. "You escaped. You've been reassigned in their internal records as deceased. Someone recently updated that record." She knew this. She knew most of this. But hearing it laid out in flat declarative sentences by a man she had known for 12 days in a room she had never expected to be standing in did something to the architecture of composure she'd been maintaining, applied pressure to a joint that wasn't as solid as she'd told herself it was. "The person who updated the record," she said. "Do you know who it is?" "I have a name." He paused. "I also have a problem." She waited. 48 hours ago, Damien said, 2 men were photographed in the city. Not mine. Not law enforcement. They've been traced to a logistics company that acts as a transport arm for the same network. He looked at her. "They're not here for me." The room was very quiet. "I moved a camera," Elena said finally. Not to him, not exactly, to herself. 2 weeks before I came here, I had to... There was a cafe I used when I needed to access certain things. I moved because someone found the cafe. I thought I was... She stopped. "I thought I'd been careful enough." "You had been," Damien said, "for 4 years, which is longer than most people manage against an operation that's been running since before you were born." He stood up from the desk. "The problem isn't what you did wrong. The problem is that they recalibrated after losing you the first time, and the methods they're using now are more sophisticated." She looked at him. "You're telling me they tracked me here?" "Not yet," he said. "But they're narrowing a radius, and this address is in that radius." Elena thought about the bag upstairs. 11 minutes to pack it. She'd done it faster. She thought about the road outside the manor gates, the car she didn't own, the money she had in 2 accounts under names that might or might not still be clean. She thought about the photograph behind the baseboard heater, the 5 sets of initials, The fact that 4 of them belonged to people she had known. "The others on that list," she said. "The photograph. Where did you get it?" Something shifted in Damien's expression. The first thing she'd seen move there that wasn't controlled. Which photograph? She told him where she'd found it. He was around the desk and out the door in 4 seconds, moving with a speed and purposefulness that said this was not the detail he'd expected. She followed him up the stairs, down the corridor, into the guest room. He crouched beside the baseboard heater and looked at the photograph without touching it and was still for a long moment. Then he stood up and took his phone out. "Parker," he said when the call connected. "Someone's been in the East guest room. I need to know when and how." He paused, listening. "No, don't touch anything. Get me a window on every access point for the last 72 hours. He hung up. He looked at Elena. "The photograph wasn't placed by anyone I authorized," he said. His voice was flat and controlled, and underneath the control was something that functioned like the sound a dam makes before it gives. "Which means someone else knows I'm here," Elena said. "Yes." She looked at the photograph still lying against the baseboard, the white columns of St. Brigid's, the 5 sets of initials, 12 days of careful invisible work dismantled in a single discovered object. "Pack what you need," Damien said. She looked at him sharply. "Not to leave," he said. "To move to a different room, one with better sightlines and a second exit." He was already moving toward the door. And Elena. She hadn't told him to use her name. He used it anyway. "The other 4 initials on that list," he said. "I need them. Whatever you remember about those people." She stood in the guest room with the photograph at her feet and the light going gray outside the window and understood, with a clarity that was almost physical, that whatever calculus she'd been running, stay, leave, trust, run, had just become irrelevant. Because somewhere in the city, 2 men were tightening a radius. And somewhere in this manner, someone had walked into a locked room and left a message she was never supposed to find. And the only exit that had ever actually existed for her was the one she hadn't been able to see yet. She went upstairs and packed her bag in. She packed her bag in 4 minutes flat. Not 11. 4. Because somewhere between the guest room and the staircase, she had made a decision she didn't fully articulate even to herself. That the time for careful, measured movement was compressing, and the margin she'd been operating within was thinner than she'd allowed herself to believe. The new room was on the 2nd floor, northwest corner. Damien had chosen it, or Harker had on his instruction, and when Elena walked in, she understood the logic immediately. 2 windows at perpendicular angles. A door that opened onto a secondary staircase that the main staff didn't use. A sightline to the motor court if you stood at the right angle to the left window. Whoever had selected this room knew what they were doing, and that knowledge sat in Elena's chest with complicated weight. She put her bag in the closet. She did not unpack it. She sat on the edge of the actual bed and made herself think through the initials on the photograph. 5 sets. Hers she knew. The other 4, MC, JR, AV, TL. She worked through them the way she worked through everything in her memory from those years. Carefully, deliberately, the way you handle something that might still be sharp. Children she had known at St. Brigid's. Not friends, exactly. The environment did not produce friendship in any conventional sense, but proximate, present during overlapping years. Faces she had not let herself think about in a long time, because thinking about them led to questions she couldn't answer, and the questions led to places she couldn't afford to go. MC had been younger than her by 2 years, a boy with a habit of counting things under his breath. She had not seen him after age 14, when she'd been relocated to the East Dormitory. She did not know what that relocation had meant for him. JR had left when Elena was 15, through what was described as a successful adoption placement. Elena had not believed that, even then. She'd had no language for what she believed instead. She'd had no language for most of it. A V was harder to hold. The initials produced a face, and then the face produced a feeling she had to breathe through. A girl 1 year older, one of the few who had been overtly kind to her in the particular circumstances where kindness was a quiet, dangerous thing, and who had disappeared from the facility one morning without announcement and was never mentioned again. TL she remembered last, and with the most difficulty because TL had been there longest and had occupied a particular role in the internal hierarchy that the facility created among children. Not authority exactly, but something adjacent to it, something the adults had cultivated and used. And Elena had never entirely resolved how she felt about that. She set all four aside. She couldn't use feelings about them. She needed facts, if she had any. She went to find Damien. He was in the study with Harker, and a man she hadn't seen before. Younger than Harker, leaner, the kind of physical precision that said former military without saying which branch or which country. They were looking at a layout on the desk that she clocked as a building schematic before any of them looked up. Those four initials, Damien said without preamble. He'd already moved on to this. He'd been waiting for her. Names, if you have them. 2 first names with some certainty, 2 I'm less sure of. She told him. Marco, first letter C, last unknown. A girl she'd called J, last initial R. A V she couldn't reconstruct. TL, she thought might be Tomas, but the last name had never been given to her directly. Children at St. Brigid's were discouraged from exchanging surnames. Damien relayed 2 of the names to the man she didn't know, who typed them into a phone without comment. The photograph, Elena said. You still don't know who put it there. The camera covering that room was looped, Harker said. 6-hour segment, repeated. Nobody who shouldn't have access appeared in any adjacent footage, which means either the loop was inserted by someone with direct access to our security system, or it was inserted remotely. Elena looked at him. Your system was breached. The breach was clean, Harker said, in a tone that communicated he found this personally offensive. Professional level, the kind of intrusion that takes time to set up. Whoever did it wasn't improvising. She thought about the photograph again, the age of it, the curled edges. That photograph isn't recent. It's at least 10 years old, maybe more. The image, yes, Damien said. The placement wasn't. So someone kept it for years and brought it here specifically. Or had it delivered. To your house. She looked at him. Past your security. Yes. She absorbed this. Organized crime lord with substantial resources and a security team that had just been quietly outmaneuvered by people who wanted her to know they could find her anywhere. The message was not subtle. It wasn't meant to be. She said, They could have just killed me. Damien's jaw moved slightly. Yes. Which means this isn't about killing me yet. It's about moving me, frightening me into running so they can intercept me somewhere less protected. That's my read, Harker said. So I stay. Neither of them disagreed. She went back to her room. She did not sleep. The following morning, Damien's man, she learned his name was Creed, which she suspected was not the name his parents had given him, reported back on 2 of the 4 initials. Marco, last name Cahill, 24 years old, current address in a city 300 miles north. J, last name Reeves, 23, last known location disputed between 2 records that didn't match. Disputed how? Elena asked. Creed looked at Damien, who nodded once. One record has her in a long-term care facility upstate under a different name. The other has her deceased, death certificate filed 8 months ago. He paused. The death certificate was filed by St. Brigid's administrative office. Cause listed as natural. Elena was 26 years old and had spent a decade being very deliberate about not feeling things in real time, deferring them, processing them in controlled conditions when she could afford to, which was not often. She was deliberate about it now. She kept her face still and her breathing even and said, 8 months ago. Yes. That's 2 months after I stopped being declared deceased in their system. The room was quiet. They're cleaning house, Damien said. It was not a question. They updated my status, Elena said, which means someone told them I was alive, which means... She stopped, started again. Which means someone who knew I was alive told them. Someone in a position to know. She thought about the note under her door. You are safe. She thought about the careful handwriting, the unsealed envelope, the way it had arrived without explanation and without follow-up. She had attributed it to Damien. She had been so certain of that attribution that she hadn't examined it. The note, she said. The one left in my room my first week. Damien looked at her. What note? The way he said it, not the words but the precise quality of his attention sharpening, told her everything before her own mind finished the sentence. You didn't send it, she said. No. The floor did not move. That was important to note. It felt like it should have. She stood in the study of Blackridge Manor on a gray Tuesday morning and understood that the thing she had been most carefully protecting against, the possibility that the safety she'd chosen was constructed, had already occurred and she had missed it, and she had in fact used it as evidence of safety while it was happening. Someone in this house knew I was here before your security flagged my background, she said. Her voice was level. She was proud of that. Someone left that note within the first week, before anyone would have had time to investigate me thoroughly, which means they already knew who I was before I arrived. Parker said, That's not possible. The hire went through standard channels, posting, application, interview. Then either the channels were compromised or someone placed me here deliberately. She looked at Damien. Did you post the position externally? Standard placement, he said. Through which service? He told Harker, who pulled it up. A domestic staffing agency, mid-size, had been managing Blackridge's household staff placements for 3 years. Clean record. No prior incidents. Get me everything on that agency, Damien said to Creed. Every placement, every contact, every financial relationship. Creed left. Elena sat down, not because she needed to, because the alternative was standing in the middle of the room with nowhere to put the weight of what she was calculating, and sitting gave her the appearance of composure, even when composure was largely architectural at this point. She had applied to 11 estates. She had chosen this one because Damien Voss's enemies were different from her enemies. But she had found this position through a listing. A listing from a staffing agency. She had not considered, in her thoroughness, the possibility that the listing had been designed to find her specifically, calibrated to the profile of what she would be looking for, placed where she would look, clean enough to pass her own vetting process, which was, she now had to accept, less thorough than she'd believed. She had not been hiding. She had been led. The realization did not arrive with drama. It arrived with the flat, nauseating clarity of something that should have been obvious and wasn't, and the particular self-directed anger of a person who had survived by being smarter than her circumstances and had just discovered a circumstance she hadn't been smart enough for. The agency, she said. How long have they been managing placements here? 3 years, Parker said. Were there other placements in the last 6 months that departed early or under unusual circumstances? Parker's expression shifted fractionally. He checked something on his phone. 2. One lasted 3 weeks, left citing personal reasons. One was terminated after a minor security concern. Creed thought she was photographing internal areas of the property. She? Yes. What happened to her after the termination? Parker looked at Damien. Damien looked at Elena. We don't know, Parker said. She left the property. We didn't follow up. Elena pressed her fingers flat against her knee. She may have been a probe, testing your security protocols, mapping the layout. She paused. I was the objective. She was reconnaissance. The silence that followed had a different quality than previous silences in this room. Heavier. The kind that came when multiple people arrived at the same conclusion simultaneously, and nobody wanted to say it first because saying it made it real. Then Damien said, They've been inside this house. Longer than I have, Elena said. Parker was already on his phone, stepping toward the door. Damien moved to the window and stood with his back to the room for a moment, and Elena watched him and understood that she was seeing the particular quality of anger that a controlled man produces when something has violated the perimeter of what he controls. Not explosive, not demonstrative. Cold. Compressed. The kind that went somewhere specific. She should have felt, under the circumstances, that she was in a precarious position. A woman who had unknowingly been used as a pawn to infiltrate a criminal enterprise's stronghold, now in a room with the man whose house had been compromised because of her presence. By most calculations, that was not a safe position. But Damien Voss turned from the window and looked at her, and what she saw in his expression was not directed at her. I need you to think about everyone you've had contact with in the last 4 years, he said. Not the people who frightened you, the people who helped you. Landlords who gave you easy terms, employers who didn't check your references too carefully, anyone who made something easier than it should have been. She understood immediately. You think there's been facilitation? I think you survived 4 years on the run from an organization with 40 years of experience and substantial resources, he said. Either you were extraordinarily capable, or I had help I didn't know about, she finished. She thought about it. She thought about the landlord in Columbus who'd accepted cash with no questions, the forged reference that had passed scrutiny twice, the one occasion when she'd been certain she was being followed and then wasn't. She had attributed each of these to luck and her own careful preparation. She sat with that assessment for a long moment and watched it come apart. There's someone else, she said slowly. Someone running a parallel operation, not the network. Someone who's been managing me, keeping me available. She looked up. Available for what? Damien sat across from her. The network is being investigated. Not officially. The official channels are compromised, but someone with knowledge of the full ledger, the complete financial trail, is in a position to dismantle it entirely. Someone who was inside long enough to know where everything is buried. He paused. Someone like you. I was a child, she said sharply. You were there for 12 years, he said, not unkindly but without softening it. You saw intake. You saw transfers. You saw which adults moved through that facility and which ones didn't appear in any official capacity. You have a memory. He stopped. That doesn't forget things, she said. Flat. Yes. The person running you, Damien said. They're not protecting you out of altruism. They've been preserving you as a resource. The word landed with a dull, specific impact. She had spent 4 years believing she was surviving on her own terms. She had been someone's contingency plan. She stood up. She walked to the window and stood with her back to the room the same way Damien had a minute ago, and she gave herself 5 seconds to feel the full scope of it, the manipulation, the years of carefully managed circumstances, the fact that her hard-won survival had been curated, and then she filed it, not away, forward, into the part of her thinking that converted damage into direction. She turned back around. The photograph, she said. 5 initials. 4 other people who were at St. Bridget's. She looked at Damien. It wasn't a threat. It was a message. Someone is telling me those people are in danger or already gone. Or it was placed to destabilize you, he said. Yes, she agreed. Both things can be true. She crossed the room and stood in front of his desk. I need to talk to Marco Cahill. He's 300 miles. I know where he is. I need to talk to him. She held Damien's gaze. If someone has been managing my movements, they may be managing his too. And if the network is cleaning house and Jay Reeves is already, if they're working through the list, she stopped. He's next. Damien looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at his phone. He made a call. Not to Creed, not to Harker. Someone whose name he didn't say out loud. 3 sentences, clipped and specific. Then he hung up. We'll have eyes on Cahill within the hour, he said. I want to speak to him directly. We'll arrange it. She nodded. She started toward the door, stopped. The person running me, she said without turning around. If they've been coordinating my movements, they knew I came here. They may have wanted me here specifically. Yes, Damien said, which means they wanted me near you specifically. Silence. She turned. He was watching her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not calculating, not controlled. Something more exposed than that. Something that said he had arrived at the same destination a few seconds before she had, and had been waiting for her to catch up. You're connected to St. Bridget's somehow, she said. Not an accusation. A fact she was stating as it assembled. He didn't look away. Not the way you're thinking. Then how? He was quiet for 3 seconds. 4. Long enough that she started preparing for a deflection. My sister, he said. Elena stood very still. She was placed there 22 years ago, he said, through a private arrangement. She was 4 years old. I was 12. He said it the way a person recites facts they have had to recite many times in order to be able to say them without breaking. I didn't know where she was until 6 years ago. By the time I found the facility, she had been in the system for 16 years and was listed as deceased. Elena's mouth was dry. Was she? The pause before his answer was the longest pause she had heard from him. I don't know, he said. That's the part I haven't been able to, He stopped. Reset. The ledgers I've been pulling. The financial trails. Part of what I'm looking for is a placement record from 22 years ago. A record that might tell me whether her file was falsified the way yours was. Elena stood in the doorway and looked at Damien Voss with the particular clarity that arrives when a pattern you've been circling finally resolves, when the shape of a thing becomes visible and is both more comprehensible and more devastating than any of the shapes you'd been imagining in its place. He wasn't protecting her out of instinct. He wasn't protecting her out of power or territory or the coded ethics of the criminal world he operated in. He was protecting her because she was the clearest living line he had ever found back to the institution that had taken his sister, and whether his sister was alive or dead, this woman standing in his doorway was the most credible witness to what that place had done that he had ever had access to. She was a resource. Again. Still. Different handler, same function. She thought she might laugh. She didn't. She thought she might say something she couldn't take back. She didn't do that either. She put her hand on the doorframe and looked at him for a long moment. Your sister's initials, she said. What were they? Damien Voss looked at her steadily. A V, he said. Elena took her hand off the doorframe. Adela Voss, 1 year older. Quiet, careful kindness in a place where kindness was a quiet, dangerous thing. Dark hair. A habit of sitting with her back to the wall that Elena had recognized and never commented on because some things you recognized without needing to name them. Gone one morning without announcement. Never mentioned again. She pressed her back against the doorframe and looked at the ceiling and breathed. 4 counts in, hold, 4 counts out, and the 6-count exhale didn't work, so she abandoned the technique and just breathed however her body needed to. And Damien didn't move from behind the desk, didn't come toward her, didn't try to manage it. He let it be what it was. She was kind to me, Elena said finally. Her voice was not entirely steady. She didn't try to make it steady. She looked out for me the first year, when I didn't know how anything worked. Damien was very still. I don't know what happened to her after I was relocated, Elena said. I looked for her for months afterward. The way you look for someone in that place, carefully, without asking directly, without letting anyone see you looking. I never found any information. She looked at him. That was when I was 15. His jaw was tight. The controlled quality of his anger was still there, but its composition had changed. It was more personal now, more specific. The anger of a man who had spent years looking for something and had just discovered it had been in contact with someone he could have spoken to months ago. She understood that anger. She didn't take it personally. The person running me, she said, they brought me here, to you, knowing your connection to St. Bridget's, knowing mine. She pushed off the doorframe. Which means they knew about Adela, about both of us. They wanted us in the same room, both holding pieces of this thing. She looked at him. We're not running a rescue operation. We're being assembled into one. Damien stood up from the desk. He was reaching for his phone when the sound hit. Not loud, not explosive. A single flat crack from somewhere outside the manor, the specific register of The crack came from the northwest perimeter. Damien had his phone to his ear before the echo finished. Elena was already moving toward the window, not to look out. She knew better than to silhouette herself against glass. But to get a sightline to the motor court from the low angle, crouched below the frame, the way she'd trained herself to do in the years when hotels and temporary rooms had required exactly this kind of positional thinking. The motor court was empty. The exterior lights were on. Nothing moved. Harker. Damien's voice was compressed to its most functional register. Northwest. Identify. A pause. Then Harker's voice through the phone clipped. Perimeter camera 7 is down. Physical breach or shot out, we don't know yet. 2 of mine are moving to confirm. How long? 4 minutes. You have 2. He hung up. He looked at Elena, still crouched below the window. Stay away from the glass, he said. She didn't respond because it wasn't worth responding to. She was already away from the glass, had been since the sound registered. He moved to the desk and opened the lower right drawer, and she heard the specific sound of a weapon being checked, the slide and click of a man doing something he had done so many times it had become entirely muscle. She stood up. "If they're here for me, they're not getting you," he said. Not gallantly, practically, the way someone states a logistical constraint. "I'm not asking for protection. I'm saying if I'm the target, using me as bait is more efficient than—" "No. Damien, no." He looked at her directly, and what she saw in his face stopped her from pushing further. Not authority, not the power of the man who owned this house and every resource in it. Something more stripped than that. Something that had to do with a 4-year-old girl placed in an institution 22 years ago and had been building since in the particular compressed way that men like him built things. "We do this my way." His phone buzzed. He looked at it, read something. His jaw tightened. "Harker's 2 men found the camera," he said. "It wasn't shot out. It was physically removed. Clean removal, mounting screws intact." He looked up. "They were on the grounds before dark." Elena's mind ran the calculation fast. Before dark meant before the conversation in the study. Before she'd told him about the note. Before the schematic. Before any of the evening's revelations. They hadn't come in response to anything that had happened tonight. They'd been positioned, waiting, already inside the perimeter before anyone in this house had fully understood the shape of what was coming. "They're not here to take me," she said. "Not tonight. They're here to watch, to confirm I haven't run, to keep me in place until what?" She thought about the staffing agency, the probe who'd been terminated 3 months ago, the security system breach that had placed the photograph, the months of preparation that had preceded her arrival. All of that infrastructure didn't exist to grab one woman off a property. It existed to build towards something. "Until whoever's been managing me gives them a signal," she said. "The person who brought me here. They're not just a handler. They're running both sides of this. They've been positioning the network and positioning me simultaneously. When they're ready, they collapse the distance." Damien was very still. A controlled extraction. Or a controlled delivery. She held his gaze. "I don't know which one I am in this scenario. I don't know if I'm being rescued or handed over." The silence that followed lasted exactly as long as it needed to. Then Creed appeared in the doorway. No knock, direct entry, which told Elena that the normal protocols of this household had already been suspended. He had a phone in each hand and the look of a man managing several simultaneous problems, with the particular economy of someone who'd operated in conditions where multitasking was a survival mechanism. "Marco Cahill," he said. "He's not at his last known address. Left 3 days ago, landlord says. No notice given. Phone is off." He held up the second phone. "The staffing agency. Overnight registered mail delivered to their office 6 weeks ago. Return address is a logistics company in— here's the thing. The same logistics company Harker flagged for the 2 men in the city." Elena said, "They seeded my placement 6 weeks ago." 8, actually," Creed said. "The listing went up 8 weeks ago, tailored for a very specific applicant profile." He looked at her with the neutral professionalism of a man who was not going to comment on the implications of that. "Your application was the only one." The only one. She had found the listing through what she'd believed was her own vetting process. 3 layers of search, cross-referenced, filtered for her specific requirements. She had been the only one because the listing had been built for one person. She felt the particular cold clarity of a system closing around her. Not panic. She'd burned through panic years ago, and what remained on the other side of it was a functional state she'd never been able to name, something that worked like resolve but was quieter than that. Something that simply continued forward when continuing forward was the only viable option. "Creed," Damien said, "the tunnel's under the old property. Do we have current maps?" Creed's expression shifted in a way that told Elena this was not the first time this specific question had been asked in this room. "We have what we pulled from county records 6 months ago and what the source confirmed 3 weeks ago." "Get them!" Creed left. Damien looked at Elena. "We move in 2 hours before they decide their window is closing and force our hand." "Move where?" "St. Bridget's." She looked at him. "The property has been closed for 4 years. Officially." He set his weapon on the desk beside him in a way that communicated he was going to pick it up again shortly. The building above ground has been closed. What's underneath it hasn't. She thought about the photograph, the white columns, the clean institutional facade that had been maintained through 40 years of sustained reality behind it. She thought about what 40 years of infrastructure looked like below the surface of a children's home. The tunnels Damien had referenced, the transport routes, the kind of physical architecture that doesn't get dismantled when a building officially closes because dismantling it creates evidence and leaving it creates utility. They're still using it, she said, as a transit point, not as a facility. He paused. But the ledgers are there, the originals. Every transaction, every placement, every financial arrangement for 4 decades. I've been trying to locate them for 8 months. 3 weeks ago, my source told me they're in the sub-basement of the original building, in a room that was never on any architectural record. Your source, she said. The same source who's been managing my movements? He held her gaze. I don't know. She absorbed that. The honest uncertainty of it was almost more unsettling than a lie would have been, because it meant Damien Voss, a man with resources and intelligence infrastructure and 20 years of operating in circumstances where knowing who you were dealing with was elementary, was also in the dark about the center of this thing. We're both being run, she said. Until tonight, he said. After tonight, whoever's been running us finds out what that actually costs. 2 hours was not much time. Elena spent 90 minutes of it in her room not sleeping, working through everything she remembered about the physical layout of St. Bridget's above ground, and everything she'd been told and could infer about what was below. She had spent 12 years in that building, and she had mapped it the way she mapped everything, obsessively, automatically, as a form of psychological management, exits, blind spots, the location of every adult at every scheduled hour, the rhythm of the building at night versus during the day versus the strange suspended quality of Sunday afternoons when the routines were different and the building's personnel behaved differently and the rules applied with a different texture than they did the rest of the week. She had never been below the ground floor. That access had been restricted in ways she'd understood even as a child to be a different category of restriction than the normal rules. Not disciplinary, not administrative, structural. There were people who went through a door at the end of the East Corridor and didn't come back through it for hours, and the children learned very early that this was not a door you looked at when adults were near. She knew where the door was. She knew what was on the immediate other side based on the sound that sometimes came through it at night. Ventilation, she'd thought. She had been 12 years old, and she had thought it was ventilation. Damien knocked at her door at 11:45. She was already standing. They went out through the secondary staircase and crossed the grounds through a section of the property she hadn't been shown. A maintenance path along the east fence line, unlit, the ground uneven under her feet in the dark. Creed was ahead of them. Harker was behind, with 2 others she didn't know by name. There was no conversation. The group moved with the specific purposeful silence of people who had done this kind of thing before and knew that talking was for before or after, not during. The vehicles were waiting outside a service gate she hadn't known existed. 2 of them, dark, unremarkable. She got into the second one beside Damien and didn't speak for the first 10 minutes of the drive. Then she said, "If your sister is alive," "She is," he said. It was not hopeful. It was a statement of commitment. The kind of certainty that is not based on evidence but has been maintained regardless of evidence for so long it has become structural. She didn't argue with it. If she's alive and she's in that facility, the people who are there tonight are going to use her. I know. They'll use her against you specifically. I know that too. Does that change the approach? He looked at her in the dark interior of the vehicle. Does knowing that someone will try to use your fear change whether you go? She thought about that. No, she said. Then it doesn't change anything, he said. The drive was 40 minutes. They came at the property from the east, through what had once been an access road for delivery vehicles, and was now overgrown to the level of implausibility if you didn't know it was there. The building materialized out of the dark in pieces. First the roofline, then the white columns that she had spent years not thinking about, and was now looking at through a car window with a quality of attention that was purely operational. She was not 12 years old. She was not any of the ages she'd been inside that building. She was 26, and she was here for specific reasons, and she was going to stay inside that frame, until the specific reasons were resolved. Creed's voice came low from the front. 2 heat signatures on the north approach. 1 at the main entrance, stationary. Interior activity in the east basement section. That's 4, maybe 5 individuals. Thermal is imprecise at this range. The tunnel entry, Damien said, south side, below the old loading dock. Access is through a utility structure that's been maintained. Somebody's been keeping it current. Damien checked his weapon. Around Elena, the 2 others did the same. She had no weapon. She had made no request for one, and none had been offered, and she understood this was not an oversight. "You stay with me," Damien said to her, "not a question." "I know the layout above ground better than anyone here," she said. "If we need to move through the building—" "Then you lead," he said. "But you stay with me." She nodded. They moved out. The cold hit her when she stepped out of the vehicle. Real cold. The kind that arrives in the dead hours of a night and settles into the ground and the buildings and the particular quality of a place that has been holding its breath for years. The grass under the loading dock was wet. Her shoes found purchase on the concrete lip of the utility structure's door as Creed eased it open with a tool she couldn't see in the dark, and a silence that said this was not his first lock in a field. The tunnel was narrower than she'd imagined and taller. Poured concrete walls, current electrical. The lights were off, but the conduit was recent, within the last 5 years. The air had the specific quality of underground space that is circulated but not frequently occupied. It moved through her lungs with a slight chemical undertone she recognized from institutional memory and had to consciously not assign emotional weight to. They moved single file. Creed first, then Damien, then Elena, then Harker, with the 2 others behind. Nobody used lights until Creed signaled from the front, and they switched to low-frequency red. Enough to navigate, not enough to bleed around corners. She counted the distance, estimated the direction, placed herself relative to where the east corridor door had been in the building above. The tunnel ran north-northeast, which put them, she did the spatial math, emerging somewhere beneath the northeast quadrant of the original structure, below the dormitory wing. She thought about that and filed it. Creed stopped. Hand signal. Contact ahead. The group stilled. Elena could hear it now. Voices. Muffled through a wall or a floor. The specific, uninflected cadence of people doing administrative work in the middle of the night. Not agitated. Routine. Which was somehow worse than agitated would have been. Creed moved to a door on the right side of the tunnel. Not a hatch, an actual door. Institutional steel with a lever handle. He checked it without opening it. He looked back at Damien and held up 2 fingers, then pointed down. 2 floors down. The sub-basement. Damien looked at Elena. She thought about the east corridor door, the steps she'd heard going through it, the direction of the ventilation sound at night, the spatial math of where the tunnel had brought them. She leaned close to his ear. "There's a secondary access. In the original building structure. A maintenance shaft, I think, that runs between the first and second basement levels. It was in the east wall of what used to be the laundry room." She paused. "I don't know if it's on your maps." He looked at her. "How do you know about it?" "I listened to things for 12 years, she said, "and I remembered them." He made a decision in under 3 seconds, which she was coming to understand was his standard timeline for decisions of consequence. He redirected Creed with a hand signal sequence, and they moved back down the tunnel 20 meters and through a junction she hadn't noticed on the way through. The tunnel forked, and the left branch was narrower and the floor had a different texture, older poured concrete with aggregate visible at the surface. The laundry room access was where she'd said it would be. The shaft behind it was tight, 1 person at a time. Vertical ladder bolted into the concrete, the rungs cold under her hands when her turn came to go through. She descended in the dark because there was no room to hold a light, and gripped the ladder simultaneously, and she counted rungs by feel. 13 to a floor, which told her the sub-basement ceiling was high, higher than the building above would have suggested, which meant it had been purpose-built for this specific function well before the institution above it was established as its cover. She landed on a concrete floor and stepped aside for Damien coming down behind her. And in the new space, she could hear the voices much more clearly now. 3 distinct voices, possibly 4. One of them speaking on a phone, the cadence of reporting rather than conversation, one of them moving, footsteps with the specific rhythm of someone pacing in an enclosed space. The others were harder to place. Damien put his hand on her shoulder, not to move her, just to confirm her position in the dark. She felt the slight pressure of it and stayed still. Creed and Harker came down behind them. They reassembled in a low crouch in the darkness of a corridor that ran left and right from the base of the shaft, and Elena oriented herself and pointed left with as much certainty as she could build from spatial reconstruction and institutional memory. Left. They moved. The first room they passed was empty but furnished, chairs around a table, filing infrastructure along the walls, the kind of setup that was designed to be functional and was clearly used regularly. The second room had a padlock on the outside of the door. Elena noted it and kept moving because Damien's hand on her shoulder said, "Keep moving, not yet." The third room had light coming under the door. Creed positioned himself to the left of the door, Harker to the right. Damien looked at Elena and pointed back. 3 meters, stay back. And she moved back 3 meters and pressed against the wall and watched. What happened in the next 45 seconds was not choreographed. It was efficient and extremely violent in a contained way, the kind of violence that happens when prepared people enter an unprepared space and the unprepared people have just enough time to realize what is happening before it is over. 2 men, both armed, neither fast enough. A third behind a table who put his hands up and said something Elena couldn't hear clearly and was pulled to the floor and secured. A fourth who was not in the room, whose footsteps Elena heard coming from the corridor behind her. She turned and put her back against the wall, and when he came around the corner, she did the thing she'd practiced in a different kind of context. She hooked his near arm, used his own momentum, brought him down onto the concrete floor with enough force to knock the weapon from his hand, and enough control to put her knee on the back of his neck in the follow-through. She'd been 15 years old the first time she'd done that, to a much larger person, under much less controlled conditions. He stopped moving. She kept the pressure and looked up, and Harker was already there, taking over, and she stood up and her hands were shaking slightly at the fingertips, and she pressed them flat against her thighs and breathed. Damien was looking at her from the doorway of the lit room with an expression she didn't have a name for. "East wall," she said. "The ledgers." He looked at the room. At a door in the east wall she could see from her position in the corridor, a door that was padlocked from the inside, which meant someone was either in there or it was secured to restrict access. He went to it and looked at the lock and looked at Creed, and Creed had it open in 40 seconds with a pick set and unhurried hands. The room beyond was not large. Metal shelving, floor to ceiling, filing boxes labeled with dates going back decades. A fireproof cabinet in the far corner that was significantly more robust than the shelving, the kind of infrastructure that was built to last and built to resist, and which was not locked because someone had been in here recently, was possibly still in here. The cabinet door was standing open and papers were spread across the small table in the center of the room. And at the table, with papers in hand and the specific composure of someone who had been expecting this exact moment and had decided some time ago how they would look when it arrived, sat a woman Elena had never seen before. 60s. White hair cut short. The kind of stillness that was not fear. That was a person who had decided they were done running a long time ago. She looked at Elena, not at Damien. "You took longer than I thought," she said. Her voice was even, unhurried, with the particular quality of someone who had been holding something for a very long time and was close enough to putting it down that they could afford composure. Elena looked at her. "You're the one who brought me here." "I brought both of you here," the woman said. She looked at Damien then, briefly. "It took me 3 years to find a way to get you in the same room. I hope it was worth the time." Damien said, "Who are you?" The woman set the papers down on the table. She folded her hands. "My name is Ruth Calder. I spent 19 years as the financial administrator of St. Bridget's Children's Haven. I built the ledger system you're looking at." She paused. "I also spent 19 years telling myself that what I was facilitating was not what I knew it was, and then I spent the next 12 years trying to find a way to end it that didn't get everyone involved killed before the evidence could reach someone who could use it." "The placement agency," Damien said. "Mine," she said. "The listings, the routing, the managed movement of Miss Vale over the past 4 years. All coordinated to bring her here, to you when the documentation was complete enough to be unassailable. She looked at Elena. I kept you alive. I'm aware that's not the same as having protected you. I'm not asking for absolution. I'm asking you to look at what's in this room. The room was very quiet. Elena looked at the shelving, the filing boxes with their dated labels, the open cabinet with its spread of documents. Adela Voss, she said. What does the ledger say about her? Ruth Calder looked at her for a moment. Then she reached across the table and pulled a single folder from the papers spread in front of her and held it out. Elena didn't take it. She looked at Damien. He crossed the room in 4 steps and took the folder from Ruth Calder's hand and opened it and read what was on the first page. And Elena watched his face and saw the thing that moved through it. Not relief, not grief. Something that existed in the territory between them. Something that a man carries for 22 years and then sets down, and the setting down is almost indistinguishable from the weight of picking it up was. He looked up. She's alive, he said. His voice was not steady. He did not try to make it steady. She's in a placement facility upstate. Different name. She's been there for 6 years. Elena put her hand on the doorframe. Outside the sub-basement, through the concrete and the old building above and the cold night air beyond that, somewhere in the distance she heard the first sound of approaching vehicles. Not one, not two, the coordinated arrival of multiple vehicles moving fast. And Harker appeared in the corridor doorway with his phone in his hand and said, Federal units, 12 vehicles. Someone called them in. Ruth Calder looked at the ceiling as if she could see through it to the approaching lights. I sent the preliminary documentation package to 4 separate federal contacts 40 minutes ago, she said. The kind of package that doesn't get buried, the kind that arrives with enough redundancy that losing one copy doesn't help anyone. She looked at Damien. I also sent them the location. Damien looked at her with an expression that was not gratitude and was not anger. You could have done this years ago. I could have gotten everyone in this room killed years ago, she said. There's a difference. Above them, the sound of the vehicles was getting louder, and in the corridor, Harker and Creed were already moving through the protocols of a situation that was transitioning from covert to overt, and Damien was still holding the folder with his sister's name on it, and Elena was standing in a sub-basement she had spent 12 years not knowing existed beneath the building that had shaped every reflex she possessed. And Ruth Calder was still sitting at the table with her hands folded and the particular composure of a woman who had just placed everything she had on a single move and was waiting to find out. The first federal unit came through the loading dock entrance 40 seconds after Harker's warning. Not aggressive, controlled. The specific precision of a team that had been briefed and knew what they were walking into and had decided the situation called for containment rather than escalation. 4 agents in tactical gear, weapons raised but not firing, moving through the tunnel junction with the clipped efficiency of people operating on a clock they hadn't shared with anyone in this basement. Damien did not lower his weapon immediately. Elena watched him make the calculation, the folder still in his left hand, his weapon in his right, the agents fanning into the corridor with flashlights cutting across the concrete, and she watched him arrive at the decision with the same compressed speed he brought to every decision, and he lowered the weapon and held both hands visible and said nothing. Creed and Harker followed his lead. The lead agent, female, 40s, the kind of face that had been doing this long enough that nothing in this basement was going to visibly surprise it, scanned the room and landed on Ruth Calder, still seated at the table. Ms. Calder, she said. Agent Marsh, Ruth said, with the familiarity of prior contact. You're all right. I've been all right for some time, Ruth said. I was waiting for the documentation to be complete enough that all right would mean something. Agent Marsh looked at Damien, at Elena. She didn't ask who they were. She knew, Elena understood, because Ruth's package had been thorough and the 40 minutes between transmission and arrival had been used well. We need everyone out of this room, Marsh said. The evidence stays. Your people stay clear of it from this point forward. Damien looked at the folder in his hand. That goes with me, he said. It was not a request. Marsh looked at it, looked at him, made the same kind of compressed decision. Make a copy first. Original stays. Creed had a phone out and photographed every page before Damien set the folder back on the table, and the specific care with which Damien placed it precisely aligned with the edge, the same orientation it had been in when he'd picked it up, was the most unguarded thing Elena had seen him do. They went up through the tunnel and out through the loading dock into the cold night air, and Elena filled her lungs with it and stood on the wet grass of what had been, for 12 years of her life, the perimeter she could not cross, and she breathed and did not assign it meaning. She was 26 years old on a cold night outside a building that no longer had power over her. That was the only meaning available, and it was enough. The next 6 hours were the specific exhaustion of aftermath. Federal processing, statements given in a mobile unit parked on the north side of the property. The repetitive precision of recounting what had happened in what order to agents who listened without expression and typed without comment. Elena gave her statement in full. She had been giving statements in her head for years, cataloging, organizing, the instinct to document that had developed somewhere in adolescence as the only available form of resistance, and the actual experience of saying it aloud to someone with the authority to act on it was something she hadn't prepared for adequately. She sat in the mobile unit at 3 a.m. and described Street, Bridget's children's haven from the inside, and she did it with the flat, methodical precision she brought to every task. And somewhere around the 40th minute, her voice stopped working correctly for approximately 90 seconds. She pressed her lips together and breathed through her nose, and the agent across from her, young, male, the particular careful stillness of someone who had been trained for exactly this quality of testimony, did not prompt her or look away or do anything except wait. She continued. She finished. She signed what needed to be signed. When she came out of the unit, Damien was leaning against the exterior with his arms crossed and his head slightly back, looking at the sky with the specific blankness of a man who had been running on something besides sleep for long enough that the machinery was beginning to show the strain. He looked at her when she came out and didn't say anything immediately. "Your sister," she said. "What happens now?" "Marsh has a team going to the facility upstate at first light," he said. They'll handle the transfer carefully. I've been told." The slight hesitation on the word carefully said everything about how much weight he was giving that promise, and how much he was choosing to extend it anyway, because the alternative was going up there himself tonight and making 6 years of careful legal infrastructure irrelevant. Elena nodded. "That's the right call." "I know," he said. He didn't sound like he entirely felt it. "I know it is." She stood beside him in the cold and looked at the white columns of St. Bridget's, now visible in the field lights the federal team had set up across the front of the property. She looked at them and waited for the specific thing that places from your past do to you when you're standing in front of them after years. The distortion of memory against present reality, the way a thing can be physically smaller and psychologically enormous simultaneously. She waited for that. It didn't come. What came instead was simpler and harder to name. The building was a building. The columns were concrete. The institution that had operated inside it was, as of tonight, being systematically dismantled by people with the authority to make that dismantling permanent. The building would be seized. The leadership would be prosecuted. The financial infrastructure that had protected it for 4 decades was in federal custody on a table in the sub-basement. It was over. Not cleanly. Nothing this old ended cleanly, but structurally, irrevocably, it was over. She was still alive. She took that fact and held it without doing anything with it for a moment, the way you hold something fragile that you've been afraid to touch for a long time. Ruth Calder was escorted out of the property at approximately 4 a.m. in federal custody, but not in handcuffs, a distinction that Elena noted and understood. Ruth had turned herself in as much as she had been caught. The arrangement between her and Agent Marsh predated tonight by enough that the shape of the legal outcome had already been negotiated in some form. Elena watched her cross the wet grass toward the vehicle, and Ruth turned once before getting in and looked at her. Elena looked back. She did not nod. She did not gesture. She simply held the woman's gaze for 3 seconds, and then Ruth got into the vehicle and it drove away. What Elena thought about Ruth Calder, she kept to herself. It was complicated enough that it required more than one sitting and more context than a night like this provided. The woman had built the ledger system that made the trafficking operation function. She had also spent 12 years reconstructing that same system into evidence. Both things were true. Elena was not in a position to resolve them tonight, and didn't try. Parker drove them back to Blackridge Manor as dawn was beginning its slow assertion against the eastern sky. Elena sat in the back beside Damien, and neither of them spoke for most of the drive. She was aware of a quality of exhaustion that was different from physical tiredness, something deeper than that, the specific depletion that arrives when a thing you have been braced against for years is no longer there, and the muscles that were holding the brace don't know yet how to release. At some point during the drive, she became aware that she had fallen asleep against the door, not comfortably, her neck at a slight angle, and the cold of the window against her temple. And when she woke as the car turned through the manor gates, the quality of the light had changed, and Damien was looking forward with his elbow on the armrest and his fist against his mouth, and was not asleep. She straightened up, said nothing. He said nothing. They went inside. The weeks that followed had the particular texture of aftermath, which is different from peace. The federal investigation moved with the deliberate pace of something that was being built to last. Not rushed, because rushing evidence of this complexity was how it fell apart in court, and the people prosecuting it were acutely aware that 4 previous attempts to investigate Street Bridget's had been absorbed and neutralized by the same financial connections that were now being excised. 40 years of operations generated 40 years of evidence. The processing took time. Elena stayed at Blackridge Manor. She had not discussed this with Damien. It wasn't a decision she made so much as a continuation of not leaving, which was itself a form of decision she wasn't ready to examine too directly. She kept her room. She kept her work schedule, because the structure of it was something she needed in the formless period after a crisis, the same way she needed the blanket folded on the floor beside the bed. Though after the 3rd week she stopped sleeping on it. She slept in the bed. She didn't make a ceremony of it. One night she was on the floor, and the next night she got into the actual bed, and the mattress was as good as it had always been, and she slept for 6 hours without waking, which was more sleep than she'd had in a single stretch in years. And when she woke, she lay still for a moment, and the ceiling of the room was just a ceiling. Pris noticed the change before anyone else. Pris noticed most things, which Elena had long since recategorized from liability to simply true. "You look different," Pris said one morning over breakfast, in the way that meant she'd been sitting with the observation for a while and had decided to release it. "Different how?" Elena said. Pris thought about it, chewing the inside of her lip. "Less like you're waiting for something to hit you." Elena considered that. "I'm working on it," she said. Pris nodded. That was enough for her. The call came about Marco Cahill in the 3rd week. He had not, as Elena had feared, been found through the network's cleanup operation. He had, in fact, been the one to disappear himself, preemptively, without coordination, on an instinct developed over a lifetime of the same ambient threat assessment that Elena operated by. He was located by federal investigators in a city 200 miles from his last known address, employed under a different name, working at a warehouse, living in a single room with 2 changes of clothing and a library card. He was 24 years old, and he had been running since he was 19. Elena was informed of this by Agent Marsh, who had become a presence in her life with the measured consistency of someone fulfilling a duty they took seriously. Marsh delivered information without editorial comment and answered questions without deflection, and did not pretend that the process was moving faster than it was. Elena respected this. "He's cooperating," Marsh said. "His testimony covers a period we don't have documentation for, the mid-period, roughly 15 years ago. It fills a gap." "What about the others?" Elena said. "The other initials." Marsh was quiet for a moment. "J.R. J. Reeves. The death certificate was falsified. She's alive. She's been in long-term psychiatric care under a different name. The facility isn't connected to the network. She was placed there through an actual legitimate adoption that failed in specific ways, and she's been there for 8 years. We're working on what her options look like going forward." Elena pressed her hand flat on the table in front of her. "And TL?" Another pause. The kind that said the answer was not the same category as the previous ones. "We found a record," Marsh said. "I'm sorry, Elena." She nodded. The motion was automatic. She kept her hand on the table and breathed. "When?" 11 years ago. The record was buried in the financial transfer system. The way they coded it, it looked like an administrative processing fee. We almost missed it. Marcia's voice was careful in the way of someone who has delivered this kind of information before and has learned that careful doesn't fix it, but matters anyway. His name was Thomas Lane. He was 17. Elena said nothing for a long moment. Thomas Lane, TL. The boy who had occupied the role the system created for its longest-term residents, the one who navigated the hierarchy with a pragmatism that 11-year-old Elena had observed and not fully understood, and now, at 26, understood entirely, and forgave in a way that arrived without effort because she understood what it cost to survive in the particular way that place required you to. 17 years old, 11 years ago. "Thank you for telling me," she said. She sat alone in the staff dining room for a while after Marsh left. She did not cry. She was not unaffected. The absence of tears was not the same as absence of grief, and she knew the difference because she had spent years confusing them. She sat and held the information and gave it the weight it deserved without letting it become a door she walked through and couldn't come back from. After a while, she got up and went to find something to do with her hands. She was in the garden, which she had started working in 3 weeks ago, initially because the exterior needed attention and the ground staff were stretched, and subsequently because there was something in the specific physical negotiation of soil and growth that she found useful. When Damien found her on a Tuesday afternoon in the 5th week, she heard him before she saw him, the particular rhythm of his footsteps that she had learned within her first days at the manor and had never stopped tracking. He sat on the low stone wall at the edge of the garden and watched her work for a minute without speaking. This was something she had come to understand about him, that he used silence not as performance or pressure, but as actual waiting, the genuine kind, the kind that said he had something to say and was organizing it correctly first. She kept working. The soil was cold and she'd forgotten her gloves and her hands were going to ache later, but the ache was present tense and specific, and that was useful. "I went to see her yesterday," he said. Elena sat back on her heels. "How is she?" Damien looked at his hands. He was quiet for a moment that had a different quality than his usual ones, less organized, more unguarded. "She doesn't know me," he said. "Not yet. She was 4 when she was placed. There are gaps. Things the years did that aren't going to be undone quickly." He paused. "She's 32 years old, and there are things she remembers that are wrong and things she doesn't remember that were real, and the doctors say that working through that takes time and takes careful work and can't be rushed." Elena looked at him. "But she's out." "She's out," he said. "She has a room that's hers. They said she has a particular way of folding things. Very precise, very specific." He stopped. Something moved through his expression. "I don't know if that's her or if that's what that place made of her. The doctor said maybe it starts as what the place made, and over time it becomes what she made of what the place made. That there's a difference, and eventually you can feel the difference." Elena thought about the blanket she'd stopped sleeping on, about the way she folded things now, still precise, still exact, but slower than it used to be, less like bracing. "I think that's probably right," she said. He looked at her then, directly, and held it in the way he rarely did, without the calculating quality, without the assessment running underneath, just looking. "She asked the nurse a question," he said. "After my visit. The nurse told me afterward." He paused. "She asked if I was going to come back." Elena did not say anything. She waited. "I told the nurse yes," he said. "I told her every week, for as long as it takes." He looked at the garden, then back. "I've been in contact with legal people about the placement records. Her name, her real name, can be restored. Her history can be documented accurately. It takes time, but the process is clear now." He paused. "Clear is something we didn't have before." Elena went back to the soil. She pressed her fingers into the cold earth and turned it, and thought about clear and what it cost to get there. "Marsh called me," she said, "about the prosecutions." "I heard. The 4 officials with federal oversight connections are facing charges. 2 of them already had lawyers negotiating. The ones who founded the financial side of the operation, the charity structure, the endowment that funneled the processing fees, Those records are complete enough that the attorney's offices say the case is solid. Ruth Calder's testimony, Damien said, and the ledgers, and mine, and Marco Cahill's. She paused. It'll take years in court. Yes. But it won't be buried this time. No, he said. It won't. She turned the soil. The afternoon light was thin and flat, the kind that arrived at the end of autumn without committing to warmth, and the garden was mostly dormant. But there were things in it still alive that she'd been tending, and the tending was doing something she hadn't expected it to do. It was making her want to come back tomorrow and check on them. That wanting, small, specific, forward-facing, was something she'd lost for such a long time she hadn't registered it was gone until she found it again. She sat back on her heels and looked at the beds she'd cleared and the ones that still needed work, and the stone wall where Damien sat with his elbows on his knees, present but not pressing, existing in the same space without requiring anything of it. She thought about the night she'd arrived. The canvas bag lighter than a child's backpack. The bed she hadn't been able to sleep in. The card in the unsealed envelope that someone else had put there, and she'd attributed to safety and had been wrong about in the specific way and right about in the larger one, because the manor had become safe, not because of a note, but because of the complicated sequence of events that followed it and the choices made by imperfect people on both sides of a history that was now being documented properly for the first time. I've been looking at positions, she said, carefully, watching the soil. There's an advocacy organization. They work with adults who aged out of long-term institutional care, helping them navigate documentation, housing, the bureaucratic structures that are almost impossible to work through if you don't know how they function. She paused. I know how they function. Damien didn't respond immediately. When he did, his voice was even. When? I'm not sure yet. It's preliminary. She glanced at him. I'm not leaving tomorrow. He nodded once. The position is here as long as you want it. I know. She did know that. The knowing of it was uncomplicated in a way that still caught her off guard sometimes. That's part of what makes it possible to think about leaving eventually. When I'm ready. He was quiet for a moment. That makes sense, he said, simply, without loading it. She went back to work. The afternoon passed in the specific unhurried way that afternoons pass now, so not suspended, not braced, but moving at its actual pace, which she was still learning to allow. Damien remained on the wall for a while longer and then went back inside, and she heard his footsteps go across the terrace and through the door, and she kept working until the light went flat enough that she couldn't see the soil clearly anymore. She pulled her hands out of the earth and looked at them. Dirty, cold, the knuckles slightly raw. She turned them over once and looked at the palms. They were not shaking. She cleaned them on the cloth she'd left on the wall and gathered the tools and brought them back to the storage area at the side of the house. And she locked the latch on the storage door and stood in the half-dark of the early evening, with the smell of cold soil still on her hands and the manor behind her with its lights coming on window by window as the evening arrived. Somewhere in a city upstate, Adela Voss was in a room of her own, possibly folding something with the precise, careful movements of a person who had made order out of chaos for so long. The habit had become identity, and a doctor somewhere in that same building was patient enough to understand that identity built under pressure could be rebuilt on different terms, slowly, with time. Somewhere in a federal processing center, Ruth Calder was in the middle of a legal process that would define the remainder of her life based on the full accounting of what she had done and what she had undone, and whether those two things could be weighed against each other in a way that a court could adjudicate. Somewhere, Marco Cahill was sleeping under his own name for the first time in years. Somewhere, Jay Reeves was beginning a process of recovery that no one could time or guarantee. Somewhere, Tomas Lane was only in the past. That was the hardest one. It would always be the hardest one. She had room for that. She went inside. The kitchen was warm. Goran was finishing the evening prep and acknowledged her with his standard nod, and she washed her hands at the sink properly, and the cold water on her raw knuckles stung in a direct, present tense, uncomplicated way. She dried them. She made a cup of tea she didn't particularly want because the process of making it was grounding in the way that simple sequential tasks could be. She took the tea to the window at the end of the kitchen corridor. the one that looked east, toward the part of the ground she'd been working in. The garden was invisible in the dark now. She could see the outline of the stone wall and the suggestion of the bed she'd cleared and nothing else. She drank her tea. She thought about the hook, the word she'd never had for the thing that had kept her going through the years of running and hiding and careful invisible survival. The small, persistent forward pull. Come back tomorrow. Check on the thing. See what it does next. She'd thought for a long time that it was fear driving her forward, the specific momentum of running from something. She understood now, in the quiet of an ordinary evening in a house that had stopped being temporary, that it had never only been fear, that underneath the fear there had always been something else, something that wanted to find out what happened next, that refused to let the story end in the basement of a building with white columns on the outside and something else entirely within. She finished the tea. She rinsed the cup and set it to dry. She went upstairs to her room, the room that had been assigned to her and that she had moved from and moved back to, and that was, by any reasonable accounting, hers now. She sat on the edge of the bed. The blanket she'd used to sleep on the floor was folded at the foot of it, not because she needed it as a floor option anymore, but because she liked the weight of it across her feet when the nights were cold. She looked at it for a moment. Then she turned off the light and got into bed and pulled the blanket up and lay in the dark of a room that was exactly the right size, with the window she'd learned the look of in every weather and the radiator that made a faint sound when the temperature dropped. And she breathed. Not counted breaths, not structured technique, just breath. The way a person breathes when they are somewhere it is safe to breathe without thinking about it. And the nightmares did not come. They did not come the next night either, or the one after. And in the slow accumulation of nights that followed, ordinary nights, imperfect nights, nights that held grief and nights that held the tentative specific warmth of something that might, with time, become more than survival, Elena Vale learned, gradually and without ceremony, the difficult and unspectacular work of becoming someone whose future was her own. It did not happen all at once. It did not happen easily. There was no moment of transformation, no clean line between what she had been and what she was becoming. There was only tomorrow. And the decision to meet it, that was enough. For now, and for a long time after, it was enough.